watched probably like 25 people. Someone.
Exactly. All these people just saw me.
But you had good deal.
So can you get one in the
that Congress can act quickly here. I think it's a fair point, just understanding how narrowly divided the Congress is, how polarized Washington, D.C. is. But just to bring us back full circle, I also think it's why the polling that we're releasing today is so important. These types of numbers will get the attention of policymakers on both sides of the aisle. 80+% of individuals and voters concerned about AI, this huge concern about trust, a third of voters concerned about the future of their jobs. Those are the type of things that drive outcomes here, and I think those members of Congress, whether the federal and state levels, that are willing to take this on are going to see that they're going to get a public recognition for that that's going to matter at the ballot box. And that's what we're going to be pushing here in order to try to create some momentum around these issues. Grateful for Tommy and the On Message team for the hard work on this, and grateful for the discussion here, I think, to contextualize what's at stake and what the future looks like, where hopefully we can achieve a healthy ecosystem for the benefits not just of journalists, media organizations, but also the communities, the audiences that we serve that really rely on us to be able to deliver trusted, fact-based information. Thank you all for the conversation today. Let's give this panel a round of applause. Thank you. All right, so up next, we're going to get it with the Congress that's been shut down for 22 odd days. So I'm not super hopeful that something can happen like that, but I think that means that we have to think about, again, back to the trust issue. How do we make sure that our organizations are being as trustworthy as possible? The JCPA would provide a mechanism for us to be broken out of not being able to collectively negotiate and create a power for our side.
But I also believe that the journalists need to be compensated on these efforts. And we've seen in France where there's these sort of ideas of neighboring rights to make sure that journalists are compensated for these deals. I think something like that could really work well. But right now, we are going against a huge issue, which is the fact that big tech is so much bigger than us. But we actually have more power than we here in this room.
Downstairs?
Downstairs.
Downstairs, one level, two.
I invite people to talk to Vinay and about this. He can go really deep into the program. It's pretty amazing.
And I'm going to call out Steve Uckerman and talk to him about it too, because he's been deep on this and he understands this technology because he's a smart guy.
100%.
So, okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So anyone else have an interest?
Any last comments?
We are in 2D01, so if you'd like to get a demo.
The whole time I've heard that content, that's been my one, like, kind of like AJ.
Are you guys YouTubers?
Yeah.
Oh, can I subscribe to your channel?
You want the name?
What's your name? I'll subscribe.
Rock You from the trailer for F1 movie, I thought was just a brilliant decision. Oh, I love it.
Layla in Goodfellas.
Yes! Oh my God, so good, so good. All right, well, thank you. If you are interested in learning more about how to manage this chaotic process, my company doesn't do it, but it provides the platform. You can reach out to me on the QR code. And please watch Inside the NBA on ESPN. Is that tomorrow or tonight? Tonight, debuting tonight. Now it's on ESPN. And stay tuned for what is happening at F1 because, oh my God, it's just the coolest thing. And I'm not kidding, you're going to see race drivers on October 31st this year. Thank you, everybody.
On a certain level, we're leveraging that song into our programming. But if we're using, there are songs that are part of production libraries that have become part of the lexicon of some of our major programming. College, it's like our, and they're just part of the DNA. So there's always that thing.
Encourage everyone to do. Absolutely, and I really love that music is bringing the younger generation and stopping them in their tracks to see what mom or dad is watching. I was just going to add, I know we're talking about licensing commercial popular music. From a production standpoint, I would just say never shy away from music libraries. There are so many amazing music libraries out there, both large and small, very curated ones. There is music out there that is really at a level that can bring whatever mood, whatever, particular piece of content that you're creating.
You're like, oh, that's interesting. And then I realized somebody else saw that. You know who saw that? The casting director of Dancing with the Stars, James Hinchcliffe. I assume, I don't know. But I would have to believe that somebody noticed because having James Hinchcliffe, who at the time was an IndyCar driver, participate in Dancing with the Stars, all of a sudden brought in or engaged an audience that they may have had, but also then sort of spoke to those sort of like
what the business problems are, right? So how we solve those business problems would, it's all dependent on how technology evolves and what's available to us to be able to meet that. Who knows what?
Engineers in this outbreak, and also businesses. We have to engage really closely with every single one of their content creators to make sure that we're actually solving problems. That's what change fatigue. You have to deeply listen, and you really need to hear the mistakes and acknowledge it or enjoy it, right? So,
how people are going to accept that. And the change management is a problem. Any problem. And it's better that you involve all of your stakeholders and your entrepreneurs and get your buyers and aims to do that, because that will still be limiting the circles of getting the path the change management.
Sorry. Here you go.
40 years ago now, retailed at $200,000 ago. So it's very interesting that not only are we talking about language and acronyms things, we're also ultimately talking about costs moving forward. So I want to carry on through these things. We then had the birth of nonlinear. And not only did we have the birth of nonlinear, and obviously we had companies like Media 100, Avid, Final Cut Pro, Lightworks, etc. But what it was the idea that we can now use software as a means of editing our processes. Whereas we had to have expensive hardware just because of what we were trying to do was complicated, suddenly the IT world was starting to filter into it, and we can use computer standards to actually make that work. So this was our first real move of actually bringing IT standards into what was a media production process. So this was big. This was actually very big, and obviously we've seen this drift further as we go along. I threw this one in just because this one's been a big burden of all my life, and that was DVC Pro as the next innovation. And one of the reasons why DVC Pro became a real burden to me is it suddenly made capturing available to everyone. So no longer did we have camera professionals actually manage this. Suddenly a production would have a camera professional, all the producers would have cameras, anyone, the runner would have a camera. And now our shoot ratios have changed, maybe from 10 to 1 to hundreds to 1. And the whole problem of dealing with that was just immense. So there were innovations that personally I really hated, but they obviously brought out the ideas of actually making media more accessible and possible through it. We'll carry on from there. For me, the next innovation was the move to file-based workflows. And I think we all know how that has grown now. And probably one of the key ones of those elements was obviously XDCAM. And we've seen how XDCAM, not only as a codec being used, but obviously in an acquisition format, has played a really big role in a lot of broadcast-style TV processes. And then finally, and this is where this merger of IT technology and media production really comes through, is when we start talking about collaboration and shared network storage solutions. And that, for me, that really came about in 2006 when we had shared storage across multiple creative platforms running through standard Ethernet style environments. And that happened in about 2006. So I think what I'm trying to do is cultivate the idea of understanding that culture and that difference of culture between the change, and seeing how technology came in to make creative processes easier and through that point. So, what's the next innovation? Well, I think everyone will put their hands up and they go, AI, okay? Well, I agree. AI is absolutely going to be a major innovation. And it's very interesting, we'll talk about AI. If you go to SMPTE, you go to HBA, and we're all following and tracking the API, and I think we all concur that AI is in its teenage things, and we're waiting for that next step. And that next step's not just about AI, but how we bring AI into our production. What are the title of the setup that's going on? So I looked at that title a little bit further, and I thought, well, what does that tell me? What does it say to me what I'm trying to show here? And it's very difficult to work that out. So I thought, okay, let's make an acronym of that. So here I am, I'm doing a subject on CCSM WCA. So that makes things a lot clearer. So it made me start to think about, actually, acronyms are a great way of understanding the language that's been involved in either case. As soon as we have to start translating acronyms, then we realize we're in the other camp. So how can we bring that together? And I thought about a company that I used to be involved with, a company called Route 6. And one of the taglines they had was technology for the creative. And this is what we're going to be talking about how we can bring technology into that creative workflow experience. So make it accessible and make it easy to understand what's going on with those systems. So before I headed into that, I wanted to look at the history of where technical innovations came about and why it changed the creative process, what's going on. So I thought I'd start right at the beginning. So 1956, sadly I can actually tell you all that I've touched every one of these technologies, so thanks everyone. So the first one was 2-inch magnet, the actual ability to first record media onto a magnetic device. So obviously TV was all live, suddenly we could record it, suddenly we can play it back at a different time of the day. 2-inch magnetic meant you had to splice, you actually had a razor blade and a splice to edit on a magnetic tape. We then moved to 1-inch. Now 1-inch was a big change in what was going on, because what 1-inch meant is that now I had control of that text, now I had the ability to edit that information in an electronic fashion. The concept of the edit suite was born, and now we could actually edit across those elements. Big constraint with 1-inch was that it was built upon broadcast transmission standards, POW, NTSC, CCAM, etc. So it was very difficult to actually edit with and required a very strong technical knowledge to actually deal with that process. And this is where one of the big revelations came about, and that was the move to cassette-based tapes. Okay, so what happens with cassette-based? I had a cassette, I put it in the machine, I played it. It became very, very simple. And suddenly it changed the way we edited. These machines then came into the edit suites. We didn't no longer have tape ops and machine rooms outside. Everything was contained there, and that changed the way that we thought. And it actually brought about quite a lot of other changes at that time. First of all, it removed the broadcast standards and got us to think about video in its component terms. Secondly, we also saw the introduction of digital, and that was critical because now we have things like DigiBetacam, D1, DCT, etc. So it was great that we now had that ability to not only be able to edit where we wanted to edit, to bring that environment into the edit suite, but we also didn't have to rely on the understanding the technology to actually deal with the analog process and work in digits. And that brought about lots of products that led on from there. I showed this one slide. This was an Abacus A64. This allowed us to manage a 30-second sequence and do multi-layering processes at standard depth video. Collaboration, improved asset management across the whole systems. Multi-platform, the ability for a production to be accessed from multiple ways, whether that's a direct connect, whether that's a browser, whether that's a website, whether that's a mobile phone. That ability to combine collaboration and asset management in production is very, very powerful. But then on the Pixit side, I could be talking to you about the seamless ability to manage your access with complex storage and tier strategies, ensuring you maintain control of your data and of your cost. Again, the idea and thoughts and the very different culture between those two things are completely separated. And that caused me to think about, what are we demonstrating here? What are we talking about? And we probably don't want to go into detail on those products. We actually want to talk about that culture. And that culture is the key to the success of how we move forward. So when I considered that, very, very easily, with no cost to my storage. So typically when we talk about retention and protection against delete, we tend to have to duplicate the media. And that's a big issue on the whole story. So the benefits here is no duplication of media, protection of that media going on, multiple people accessing the same media at the same time. But at the same time as doing duplicates, protection, we're also putting signatures onto every piece of data stream that goes through that. And what that means, if someone brings that media in through a very different source, we will recognize that. And even if it's when we look at our media file, we have a header, has a name, and that points to a data stream, which is the actual media element. Now, typically, if you want that media into a different project, remember we had that different workspace before that we don't need anymore? When you want to bring that media in a different project, you have to copy it. So you will copy it into another project. That means that media is now disassociated with that project and it's duplicated. Because we can access the file level and actually manage this in what we call hard links, we can now just add new pointers. In other words, we all point to the same media binary. We never duplicate the material. Okay, and this is really powerful for many reasons. So now I can get lots of projects to access that same material without having to duplicate the information. So we have project 1, project 2, project 3 going through that process. Now the power of that comes in multiple ways. First of all, the filing system knows how many active links it has. So if someone says, okay, project 1 is now finished, I want to remove that from my storage, you can delete project 1 or archive project 1. But because there are live links to that media in other projects, that media is never taken away. So suddenly you can now remove projects knowing you will have no interference on any other project. And that's a very powerful statement to go through, because to try and manage it otherwise becomes very, very difficult. Integration with Pixit Media and its Pixstore and Engineer products. That may seem complicated, but we're going to try and allude to that a bit further as we go along. So what that brought to us is obviously the idea of bringing in hard links, bringing in mounted points, etc. And I'm going to go through and discuss with you what that actually means and why this is really important to us. As I mentioned right at the beginning of the meeting, the cultural difference between these two is a company like Pixit Media, which is very intense on data movement, IT infrastructures, etc., and a company like Projective and Strawberry, who's very focused on providing tools for the creative. What happens when we merge those two together? How useful is this and how powerful is this? So we're going to play around first of all, and we're going to talk about three sections. So I want to talk about permissions and structure. So if I look at a production today and I think about how I build and set up a production, typically there's a resource manager in there, there'll be a work order, there'll be a definition of who the team of people involved, there'll be the style of the production on that. That could be products like Monday.com, Farmer's Wife, Make, etc. Or it could just be an Excel spreadsheet, which is quite common in these scenarios. So obviously that acts as the first trigger for building and configuring a production for that. Next we have to prepare our storage. So now what we tend to do is we create different workspaces. And the reason why we create different workspaces is because we have to manage permissions, and we can only manage permissions at a workspace level. So we create a unique workspace for that one production. Once we've done that, we can then start building our folder structure about how we want the production to be organized. And under here I just painted a very simple one, which just talks about season, episodes, programs, etc. on that process. But we can put all that in place, and we do that independently. So we either copy and paste a template in there, or we'll build a folder structure, or it may even just organically grow. Finally, we can bring our creative users into that environment. Now those creative users will obviously plug into that environment as editors, ingest, graphics artists, graders, etc. And once they plug into that environment, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to build their own project template. So there'll be an Avid project, there'll be an Adobe project, there may be a DaVinci project, etc. So they will now build their own project on that basis. And then finally, we have to enable those users to have the access that we want them to see. We want to maintain that security. So now we're going to integrate our SSO, whether that's Okta or AsureAD or Active Directory, etc. We need to bring that security in to come into that process. So that's fairly typical, high-level view of just setting up production even before we start bringing in media and setting up production. And as you can see, every part is disparate. The linking of those parts is very difficult, and the fact we almost have to manually build that process. When we bring Strawberry and Pixit Media together, we can now automate that entire creation. Now I mentioned right at the beginning that work order was typically the trigger to a job starting up. So with Strawberry, because Strawberry now integrates into the storage at a file level, we're able to actually manage folder structures. Each one of those folder structures can have their own permission set up, so we can now link that folder structure and that permission up to the SSO. When we build that folder structure, which we do automatically from a template, we can also pre-populate that folder structure such that all of the project data for Adobe, Avid, etc. is already in there, so that the editor can log on and they will say, oh, you're a Media Composer editor, here is your project, and by the way, I've defined what you can look at because I have control of this project. Suddenly I can do this from a single button press. I can automate that entire process and manage controls. Got the idea of a global space concept. Okay, and this is where Pixit Media and people are now really championing the idea that you can have a global space. In other words, you can log in anywhere and you can see your storage space under that scenario. We can now take that further, because now what we have is a tool called multi-site. And what multi-site does, because we've containerized that project, I can actually use Pixit and Engineer to automatically synchronize that across multiple locations anywhere in the world. And what I can then do is say, okay, I want this project to now move. Maybe it's going to move from London to New York, or New York to LA, or LA to Singapore. Okay, and it now just moves the differences between that for that time zone to pick up that project, or for that project to be treated differently in that country. Suddenly the ability to move projects anywhere in the world becomes very easy. And again, it's as simple, I want to move that project, select your region you want to move it to, and then it automatically populates that project and that's container into that location. And remember, a container not only controls the media, the structure, the folder structure, it also controls the permissions. We can't just move data over there and then have to reset up the permissions again. So we want that permissions to be part of that package to go across. So you can enable the permissions according to how you want that to be viewed anywhere in the world and who can have access to it. And you can move that project and that permissions will track with it throughout that entire period. And that's obviously a critical thing, certainly when we're dealing with studios on this. Now I mentioned this is a future idea, a future concept, but actually one of the reasons I brought this up as a 2020 thing is that we're already enabling a lot of this technology today. So for example, we have Disney, rest of the world, with 10 centers moving projects around, managing permissions actually almost on an individual level right down to a time level. I.e. they can say that's available for that editor between the hours of 12 to 4 p.m. there, and that project will be enabled and disabled strictly to that time of that process. So they have the security of that, but also they have the ability to move that project around very easily. We're also seeing big changes in the way people are approaching productions because of this. We're seeing remote editing, but we're also seeing cloud-based editing going on. But what we're finding is that core infrastructure still needs to be required and left on-prem. So in that scenario, what we're doing is we're getting that core center to be where the archive center, where the project creation is, and then that whole project is then populated into a cloud environment so remote editors can access that within their geography. And that seems to be a very common way to keep active projects. Because we can manage the storage so tightly, we can make it really cost effective to do that process, and then as soon as that project's finished, or if it's parked, we can either bring it back down or we can put it into a different tier of cloud storage to keep our costs at the right level according to the access and activity required for that media. And that's very, very key to that process. So now we are distributing those projects around the world, but what we're also able to do is create other efficiencies. Because not only are we distributing our projects, with our phase 2 implementation, we can actually search all our media and all our projects no matter where they are hosted in the world. So one pane of glass gives me a visual reference of everything that's going on with my network. And that also means I can set up strategies of actually doing storage tiering. So maybe my archive strategy is actually going to be based in my headquarters in New York. That's where I want to put my investment. The idea of having fragmented archive around the world, managing that process, is A, not cost effective, and B, typically leads to bloating of the archive. Now I can set archive strategies around the world, all to manage an archive into one central location, and then I can use my single pane of glass to review and look at all my media and make decisions on when to bring that back again. So, we're nearing the end there. Thank you very much. I've thrown quite a lot of information there, but the idea is to ask you just to think about how you merge IT technology and recognize the advantage of that, but make it accessible and easy to use from a creative perspective. And that's what we're doing with the integration between Strawberry and Pixit Media. We're coming to the end of the show, not the show, sorry, it's still going on a bit, end of this seminar. But I'm actually based here on Pixit stand, which is right here. Do come over. There are free I call them Daleks, but they're pressure cubes. So, but come over if you have any questions. Come and ask us. And thank you very much for your time, everyone. So, what does that mean in reality? Great. I think we understand the benefit of duplicates. Great to save storage. We obviously now understand the idea that we've got container folders and we remove container productions, and we also know that if we do remove container productions, we're not going to affect any other operation. So what I did is I got a sample of the customer base, and obviously we had a look at the log of what this truly means in regards to storage terms on it. So this is a selection of our customers. These customers range from big studios to advertising agencies to corporates to sports groups. And if you look on the bottom right of each one of those panels, it will show you how much space was saved based on the fact that you're using hard links rather than having to copy or duplicate material. And it's really interesting here. The most common area is around 70 to 80%. That's a massive saving. And even my minimum area is at 15%. And this is all because we've integrated into that storage system and made this work automatically in the background without somebody else having to be involved at an IT level for operating it from a production level in that process. So these are big savings. So, last thing I want to talk about is storage tiering, and this is where Pixit Media really accelerates. Pixit Media have a technology called Engineer, and what Engineer does, and there are some key phrases that I put in there, unifies and simplifies content access across storage, intelligent tiering system, more cost effective. We always like more cost effective. So that enables us now to interface into that Engineer product. So rather than having this as a separate IT layer that needs to be managed at an engineering level, we've now brought access to all of that technology into the creative interface of Strawberry. And what that means now, I can take a project and say, okay, this project, we're not going to do any more work on this project until the shoot finishes in 2 weeks' time. Now that project is sat in my most expensive storage, the storage that I need to do real-time editing. But I'm not going to touch it for 2 weeks. So what do? I can then enable that and say, park this project and put it into another container of much lower cost storage. And that could be, a tier 2 storage, an object storage. It could be the cloud. It can be anywhere that we want on that process. But the beauty is, because that's operating within the Strawberry, first of all, I've got that container. Secondly, Strawberry gives me asset management layer to that process. So even though I've moved that project out of my active storage, I still have my proxy, I still have my metadata. I can still search, review, annotate, etc. on all of that process to the point of saying, okay, I can bring this back now, and we can speed that up. And that process of enabling a tier transfer is a simple right click and select your archive or your tier transfer protocol, and then we integrate that into Pixit Media Engineer and actually get it to enable what is actually a very complex data mover structure going forward. So that brings us in the ability to have incredible cost-effective storage. And typically what I'm finding is that one of the big phrases that come out regularly for me is sandbagging. And what sandbagging means is the editors are so fearful of losing the material because they know they're going to get access to it, and the ability to get access is so complicated that they tend to make sure they have a copy of it on their expensive storage so that it doesn't get moved on. And it's amazing just how much of that. Typically our experience with this so far, again, we've been reducing storage by 50% just by making sure you can just park this quickly, you can just move this off. It's really easy to do, it's still available to you, and you can re-put it really quickly through that process. And Pixit Media can manage that movement and also make that motion happen very quickly as well in the background. So that gives us great savings in that cost-effective model that we're trying to do. So just to summarize what we're offering then. So first of all, automatic project creation. That single button that just builds your project, builds your storage setup, sets your permissions, etc. into the system. That one SSO, that one time you log in and everything that you're allowed to see appears there for you and mounts onto your desktop. And we can do things like mounting, obviously with Adobe, DaVinci, etc. We can even enable bin locking with Avid, so you can actually have a full bin lock environment there working with the Pixit storage through the Strawberry environment. We talked about hard links, and obviously the benefit of hard links is removing the duplicates, never having media offline. So one of the nice things is somebody brings in media from another direction, we automatically absorb it and bring it in. And we know with Adobe, you could be editing from your desktop, you could be editing your central storage, you may be dragging material in from a thumb drive. As soon as we see that activity going on, we automatically absorb, consume that into the central storage, and relink that with a hard link to the central storage. So from an editor perspective, they don't see any change, but from a collaboration perspective, media is always available. It's in the project. We're tracking and managing and absorbing it all the time. And then finally, we talked about storage tiering. And obviously, storage tiering can go into multiple ways. We talked about project parking, but it could also be your archive. We could be archiving into a cloud environment. We could be archiving LTO. And this is where we can use Engineer and the tools that they've built for managing complex data moving to make that easy and accessible into a creative environment. So we're doing good with time, so I'm very pleased about it. So where does that take us to the future? And I mentioned earlier that containerized projects are really important. We talked about signatures and hard link tiering, and we talked about complex data movement. And obviously one of the things
from the Israeli government in terms of how it was handling money going to the Palestinian Authority, showing that work. We can't just rely on a headline or on a basically a trust us kind of bargain in that way. I think, Brian, to your question, what we're trying to do more of now is bring reporters together to talk as candidly as we can, and we're getting used to this, about why we cover the Charlie Kirk assassination the way that we did. Why did we use the word charismatic to describe Charlie Kirk in a headline when some of our readers were saying, why aren't you using the word racist to describe Charlie Kirk in a headline? Talking about the news judgment that goes into those choices, because a lot of people have very different opinions about that. That's me taking up a little too much time.
There was an example I loved over the weekend from the Times. During the No Kings protests, y'all put up a story that said, we focus on the crowd's content and not the counting of the audience. We're not there to count how many people showed up at the rally. We're there to focus on what they're saying. Yeah, and you were preemptively explaining why you weren't going to say the number of million who showed up, because we don't know how many million showed up.
So we send out more than 20 reporters to sites around the country to cover the No Kings protest, more than 12 photographers around the country to cover it. And we had to ask ourselves the question, are we going to spend time trying to verify crowd count numbers, or are we going to be talking to people in the crowd about why they showed up, about what they care about the most? So that is a trade-off. And look, some people were upset.
At the institutional level will go a long way in helping Americans trust the institutions that are in charge of holding and checking power at the executive level.
And by the way, for those who don't know, Patrick is leading the way on this at the Times. That's a big part of your mandate, right? Is to figure out ways to tell the audience how we do what we do. Yeah. What's been the biggest win for you so far?
Yeah, no, I want to answer that and come back to Oliver too. My job didn't exist 4 months ago. The executive editor of the New York Times, Joe Kahn, created an assistant managing editor position on our masthead for standards and trust. And trust is a key word there. We really understand, and I think Brian and Sarah put it very well, that we have to do a better job about opening up our processes and showing how we do journalism, why we do what we do, why we choose to do certain stories the way that we do. So when we do a magazine cover story in the Times like we did in June on Benjamin Netanyahu and the decisions that he was making to extend the war in Gaza in order to protect his own hold on power, we're showing the sources, the reporting, the fact gathering that goes into that. We're not just asking people anymore, hey, we're the New York Times, trust us. We have work to do. Similarly, when we're showing how the
XDS and went to a whole system. What we gained there was the ability to have both C and KU band satellite on the same receiver with about a 10th of a second transition between. So suddenly we were no longer worried about an outage, because if you lose one satellite for, I don't know, some transit outage or something, you'll switch over in a 10th of a second and you don't have to worry about it. So that was pretty nice. The last thing that EMF did on the satellite side was to add a VSAT network with new tech. to do backhaul and do that remote control via satellite. And using TDM technology, being able to stuff a whole lot of data back and forth and control the whole network that way. And with that mode, frankly, the EMF was able to grow to literally 1,000 signals. But during that time, we just kept thinking, what's next? How are we going to get there? So one idea we had was, we're tired of taking this whole
Sorry.
Whoa! Let me get back.
Yeah, I'm not going anywhere.
We don't have them because it's really big.
I told you the story about him was laptops.
We make that.
Can I tell you the story?
I'll do the same.
At the institutional level will go a long way in helping Americans trust the institutions that are in charge of holding and checking power at the executive level.
And by the way, for those who don't know, Patrick is leading the way on this at the Times. That's a big part of your mandate, right? Is to figure out ways to tell the audience how we do what we do.
Yeah.
What's been the biggest win for you so far?
Yeah, no, I want to answer that and come back to Oliver too. My job didn't exist 4 months ago. The executive editor of the New York Times, Joe Kahn, created an assistant managing editor position on our masthead for standards and trust. And trust is a key word there. We really understand, and I think Brian and Sarah put it very well, that we have to do a better job about opening up our processes and showing how we do journalism, why we do what we do, why we choose to do certain stories the way that we do. So when we do a magazine cover story in the Times like we did in June on Benjamin Netanyahu and the decisions that he was making to extend the war in Gaza in order to protect his own hold on power, we're showing the sources, the reporting, the fact gathering that goes into that. We're not just asking people anymore, hey, we're the New York Times, trust us. We have work to do. Similarly, when we're showing how the